Okay, so now we're recording. I will begin at the beginning again and say welcome everyone to this webinar on publishing your article in JHS JRS and Britannia. My name's Catherine Harlow and I'm the Director of the Institute of Classical Studies, or the ICS as it's known to many of you. We have a long working relationship, of course, with the Society for Hellenic Studies and the Society for Roman Studies. And the idea for this event came from the editors of the Society journals themselves, who have been thinking together and separately a lot about issues around diversity or the lack of it in journal publishing and specifically in their journals. So they wanted to have a discussion session, really a two-way conversation between the journal editors and the subject community to talk about how the journals operate, how it is from the point of view of a submitting author, how peer review works, and to really try to understand how the journal process can work better, but also perhaps to demystify the journal submission and peer review process for some of you who may not have submitted an article to these journals in the past and may be thinking of doing so. And I'm very glad that for this event, we have been able to partner with the Women's Classical Committee UK. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Laurence Totlin from Cardiff University, who is one of the WCC co-chairs and will be chairing this event. Over to you, Laurence.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So I am Laurence Totlin. I am no longer a co-chair of the WCC, but I am now the administrator of the WCC, and I am here today wearing that hat. So I am very pleased to introduce to you the editors of the three journals, and they are Lynn Foxall for the Journal of Hellenic Studies, Peter Troneman for the Journal of Roman Studies, and Will Bowden for Britannia. If you want to say something more to introduce yourselves, you can do so. So what we have done is to create a PowerPoint, which now I hope I will find. Nope, not my screen. Sorry. I will find it right now. My apologies.
If you can't find it, Laurence, I've just emailed it to you.
Yes, no, I do have it. I don't know what.
I know they lurk.
I think it's because it looks slightly different, this Zoom, to my normal one. So, and this is my first time. I have it now. Here we are. Here we are. So hopefully we have the slides on the screen now. Lynn, would you like to read the questions, or should I do it myself?
You can do it, Laurence.
Yes.
I think really the thing we wanted to say is that rather than talk at you, I think we're all very keen to hear what all of you think and what your views are and how we can best make submitting articles to our journals more user-friendly and more accessible. So Laurence, go for it. And we can just go question by question, I guess.
Yes, so I'm going to read the questions once, and then we'll go through them. So the first question is more for you two think about is where and how do you currently publish? So do you publish in journals, in edited collections, in monographs? Are you free to make decisions as to where you publish, or do you have things that are dictated to you by institutions, for instance? If you have a certain level of freedom, what types of factors are likely to guide your choices? The second question is, what factors would lead you to submit an article to JHS, JRS, or Britannia? What factors might prevent you from doing so? The third question is, are there issues that people perceive with peer review processes? Or are there other aspects of the submission process that some people find intimidating or off-putting? The next question is, do you think women and other underrepresented groups are deterred from submitting to JHS, JRS, Britannia, and other top journals? And here the editor says that they do perceive this to be the case. And the final question is, how can we as journal editors better support prospective authors? What kinds of support would you find most useful? So I think we can let you reflect on these questions a little bit, and then we can.
We're seeing your folder now. There you go. You might want to hit slide. Okay, yep. There you go.
There we are. Sorry.
That's okay. That's good.
I guess you see this.
Laurence, would you prefer people to respond in the chat with questions, or on microphone, or
I think if people could raise hands or put the questions in the chat, that would be the best.
I also wondered whether any of the journal editors would like to say anything about the work that you've done around looking at diversity in submissions to the journals. Sorry, the building work, which is immediately outside my window, has started on cue, but just to give a sense of where you're at in your thinking about this.
Well, I'm happy to say something about the Journal of Roman Studies, if that would be helpful. Very nice to see everyone. Peter Toneman, editor of the Journal of Roman Studies. So we published a paper in the JRS, I think 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, on gender bias and the Journal of Roman Studies, which pulls together quite a lot of data on submissions and acceptances in the journal over the past 10 to 15 years. And obviously it's something we've been keeping a very close eye on over the last few years. Just to take the sort of the crudest division possible, or simplest one to measure, that of gender. Between 2010 and 2019, we were fairly steadily averaging about 70% of submissions to the journal from male scholars, around 30% from female scholars. It's been very striking how over the last 2 years that ratio has not improved but has worsened. Over the last 3 years, we've been fairly steadily around 22 to 24% submissions from female scholars, and I think proportionate rise in the number of submissions from male scholars. I'm sure there are all sorts of reasons for that. Many of you will be aware of and all too aware, I'm sure, of the differential gender impacts of the pandemic on people's research and submission of publications. I know it's not only the JRS that's experienced a drop in submissions from female scholars over the last few years, but in light of what is now, it seems pretty clear, pretty even gender representation in the profession as a whole. I mean, it's certainly not the case that there are more male scholars out there than there are female scholars. It seems to us that there's a very striking disparity in submissions coming into the journal, and one which, at least over the last few years, there's been little sign of it improving, if anything, getting somewhat worse.
I think I have a question from Liz Shaw.
Hi, yes. Looking at those questions, I'm not quite sure how much they apply to me. I do have an article currently about to be published in the Theoretical Roman Archaeological Journal. I've only kind of got into this fairly recently, and I'm interested in publishing some paper to do with my research, which is why I've come along to this webinar. So the thing that's putting me is off, that I'm finding a little bit intimidating and off-putting, is I don't know the procedures. You know, how to apply to get stuff published, that kind of thing.
Lynn?
Can I come in on that? I think you will find that with most journals, and certainly with all three of our journals, which are published by Cambridge University Press, that if you go to the journal website, you'll find that things like the guidelines for contributors and all of the style guidelines and everything else are there online. And the first thing to do is go to the website and read those, because those tell you like the operational aspects of how you submit an article and things like that. And then once you've read those, if you have any questions, the most sensible thing to do is to write to us as editors. I get letters, emails from prospective authors all the time, and I'm delighted to get them and respond to them. It's not a problem. And if you're not sure whether your article or your proposed article is quite right for JHS or JRS, lots of people write to me about this. I'm sure Peter and Will get the same thing. Then we can give you some guidance on that and some tips and all the rest of it. We are friendly, nice people, and we don't bite, and we are happy to receive queries from authors, and we will always answer them speedily. You're muted, Liz.
Just noticed that. I just said that's brilliant. Thank you, Lynn. That's really helpful.
Good.
It seems to me that one of the, well, there are a couple of advantages actually to trying to publish in journals early on in your career, perhaps several. One is that you do tend to get very good feedback when you put your article into a journal. It's usually sent out to at least 2 reviewers who have to write a report, and sometimes those reports can be, you know, difficult to read at first, but they should be constructive, they can be detailed and make suggestions for improvement. But also, the other thing that early career scholars need to think about, I think, is that often the time to publication of an article accepted in a journal can be much quicker than something that is, say, a chapter in an edited collection. Different journals have different lengths of print queue. I remember when I was a PhD student, there was one particular journal that was notorious for taking about 2 years to get back to people, and then another year to publication. And obviously that's no good if you're doing a PhD and trying to build up a publication record. But nowadays, many journals can actually get your paper published online within a couple of months of submission. And of course, once it's out there, people start responding to it, it starts getting used. So it's another step in the process of actually getting feedback on your research and networking.
Yeah, I see in the chat that there's a comment from Ellis saying, that's exactly what I was going to say. It does seem scary and intimidating, but this is coming from a second-year PhD with no publication. So I guess the questions were perhaps aimed at scholars who are a little bit more, a little bit further in their career. So perhaps we need to go back a few steps and start at the beginning then, Lynn.
Can I say something on that? Actually, JHS publishes a lot of stuff that is written by early career scholars, including people who are still PhD students when they submit their articles. I mean, if they're good articles, they'll get published. And we're very happy with early career scholars' articles. I mean, the peer review process is completely anonymous, so whoever is reviewing it will not know that you're a second-year PhD student. But I can tell you, we've had some cracking articles from second-year PhD students, so please don't be put off by that. And again, we as editors are very happy to support you and guide you and, you know, give you advice on these things. And reviewers will give you very good feedback. Even if your article gets rejected, you will still get really good feedback on your work and on the article. So do not be put off by that. You definitely Yeah, I can see, Sophie. Yeah, you're saying the peer review is intimidating, and I can understand that. And we do try and make the peer review process as friendly as possible, in the sense that we have very explicit guidelines, certainly for JHS, and I'm sure other journals do too, that reviewers, that peer review is meant to be supportive, and that even if an article is ultimately rejected, A, we want reviewers to explain precisely why, and B, we also want them to give constructive and helpful and supportive comments, not nasty ones. So getting other people to read your work is important for your whole career stage. I mean, I'm ancient, and I always make sure that other people read my work before I let it out in public. It's just a helpful thing to do in a community of scholars.
Well,
yeah, and I would say also with sending things out to peer review, that I would, I would, as an editor, I would seek peer reviews that I know are also, perhaps, engaging with those theoretical, with those theoretical ideas. I would, look for peer reviewers who are familiar with the approach that the author is taking, and I would be mindful of of sending something that is very sort of very theoretically driven to someone who I know has perhaps a more traditional approach to the subject, and so I would take that into consideration.
So Catherine in the chat says, would it help if each of the editors said something about their journal scope, which I think would be helpful. And I think maybe for the audience, a question I would have in return is what, in your view, constitutes harsh reviews and what constitutes supportive reviews? Or, of course, some harsh reviews can be supportive as well, but because I think as you, especially as you become more senior, your view of what is supportive might change. So it's very useful to hear from people who are more junior. But yes, if we could ask the editors to tell us the scope of their journal. I think I'll start with Will.
Sure. So Britannia deals with Roman Britain and what is termed as on the journal title as kindred studies. So this means that we are well aware that Roman Britain did not exist in isolation in the Roman Empire, and that we will also consider work which is of clear relational relevance to the study of Roman Britain. We do take quite a lot of primary archaeological evidence, and we see a lot of submissions not only from academics but also from the commercial archaeology sector and the museum sector. In terms of excavation reports, we do take excavation reports, but what we ask in our excavated reports on excavated material is that they are concise and also of wider relevance. They are clearly contextualized within the broader study of the province. We also do take supplementary material. So, for example, if there are large data sets that you want that are essential to your work, then we will take those, and those will be published online in the supplementary material. And I suppose the last thing I would say is that, yeah, if you're interested, if you're writing on Roman Britain, then by all means talk to me. And I think that's I think a message that that all of us as editors would say is, if in doubt, if you've got an idea, if you think we might be interested, then do talk to us, and we will always guide you in terms of what is of how you can present your work in a way that is potentially suitable for our journals.
Thank you very much. Peter?
Sure. So the Journal of Roman Studies is a journal that publishes papers right across the span of history, art, literature, archaeology of Italy and the Roman Empire, broadly conceived in both time and space. So I think we say in our formal blurb, from the earliest times down to about AD 700. The one exception to that is we don't publish things on Roman Britain. That's because we are in effect a sister journal to Britannia, and things that come to us on Roman Britain we tend to gently shunt Britannia's way. One thing that I would say about our submissions and things that we publish in the JRS is we get around 100 submissions per year of articles to the journal, of which we publish typically between 7 and 9, which puts me as editor in the rather invidious position that 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 11 people submitting papers to the journal end up having to be disappointed, and that's simply in the nature of the submissions, the number of submissions we receive at the JRS. That is, I should say, nothing like as alarming a submissions to acceptance ratio as it sounds at first sight, because the Journal of Roman Studies is one of the leading journals of in the field of classical studies. We do get a very large number of submissions which are dramatically unsuitable for the journal, things submitted to us by undergraduates, for instance, things that are submitted by non-professional scholars that are simply not suitable for a professional journal like the JRS. In fact, realistically, the submission to acceptance ratio is much more favourable than that. In terms of my rule of thumb as editor for what I'm looking for in submissions, is I would like to think, I'm not sure anyone actually does this, but I'd like to think that the journal that we produce every year is one where the entire journal could be read from front cover to back cover with interest and profit by any Roman historian or literary scholar or archaeologist. That is to say, what we're looking for in submissions for the journal is primarily papers that are not on very narrow topics, but which have broader ramifications or broader interests for a sort of generalist audience of Roman historians, literary scholars, and archaeologists. So the papers that we end up turning down are most often not papers that are of low quality, not papers that are academically incompetent, perfectly good, solid, valuable pieces of academic research in their own right, but which are likely only to be of interest to a relatively specialized subfield within Roman studies. So, for instance, if we get papers publishing 4 new mosaic inscriptions from Zeugma, or publications of a group of oil presses in northern Baetica, or whatever it might be, these are often perfectly valuable papers, perfectly competent papers, but papers that are likely to be of interest to people only in a relatively specialized subfield. And we tend to shunt those papers towards more specialized journals in those fields, and very often they're then published almost without question in whatever the specialized journal in that field happens to be. That's not to say we don't publish papers on apparently quite specialized topics, but they tend to be in cases where those papers where the author has successfully taken their small problem or small body of text and shown why this illustrates or problems of wider significance, issues of wider interest, or might stimulate further research in the field. So just looking at, for instance, last year's Journal of Roman Studies, JRS 2021, there's a paper in there, rather short paper. We do welcome short papers as well as much longer ones, on Sapphitic graffiti from Pompeii. I mean, a study of 9 extremely short graffiti in Sapphitic from the theatre corridor at Pompeii, which is by a young scholar called Kyle Helms. but which rather marvelously opens out from this small group of texts into some really broad and consequential questions about language use in the Roman Empire more generally, and development of the Roman army in the 1st century AD, and so forth. And that for me at the Journal is the sort of main distinction between really strong, credible, academically good papers, but which are not suitable for the Journal, and papers which we tend to be much more interested in. This sense of broader significance, broader ramifications that we're looking for from a JRS paper. Just on the point about early career scholars publishing in the Journal, I should say the very first paper that I accepted as editor for the JRS a couple of years ago, published in last year's Journal, absolutely superb paper on client kingship in the Roman Near East, which I discovered only after having accepted the paper was in fact an Israeli student's master's thesis, which he'd developed in the 6 months after finishing his master's and going on to his doctorate. Absolute cracker of an article. Strongly recommend it to you. Tal Ish Shalom on provincial monarchs. So we're certainly very far from hostile to students from early career scholars. Indeed, the last couple of issues of the JRS, I think over half the articles we've published each year have been from either doctoral students or fairly immediately postdoctoral students.
Thank you very much. I'm not losing sight of the chat. We'll get back to this in a minute. Please do put in there what you consider to be harsh and what you consider to be supportive reviews. Lynn. On the scope of the JSS.
Right, okay, assuming my internet doesn't blip in and out too much. Our remit for JHS is pretty similar to that for JRS, only obviously with the Hellenic world. And again, we're interested in papers that will speak to scholars across the range of history, archaeology, literary studies, linguistics, cultural studies, reception, you name it. We go from pretty much the Bronze Age right the way through Byzantine and even into modern Greek and reception areas on occasions. So it is a very wide remit. And again, like for Peter, what we're looking for is papers that will engage with wider issues, even if the papers themselves are relatively specialist and technical. We don't mind specialist, we don't mind technical, but you need to make sure that what you're saying, even about a very small, say, bit of history or group of objects or texts or whatever, says something relevant for people beyond your own specialist subfield and makes a difference. So like JRS, JHS is very competitive, and for the same reasons, we get a number of submissions that are just not publishable. And that would not include probably any of you. It will be people who are just randomly submitting to us because it's a well-known journal. On the other hand, we do get papers that are a bit over-specialized and that we would push toward other journals or say are not quite right for JHS. And usually that is precisely for the same reasons that Peter talked about, that it's a paper where it would be of interest only to a very small number of people in the scholarly community, but that doesn't mean that you can't make these things relevant. There's a really good example in last year's JHS, published by Matthew Ward, which is about one phrase in Homer. And it sounds very boring. And when I first looked at the paper to edit it, I thought, oh my goodness, why did anybody ever accept this? Because this was accepted by my predecessor. And when I read it, I was, as an archaeologist, I was totally, utterly entranced. It's a brilliant paper. And what he does is take this one mistake in Homer, which an early scholiast corrected and say, no, it's not a mistake. It's a disruption in the meter, which is meant to show a much more widespread idea of disruption in society, in the plot, in other things. And it has much wider ramifications than just that one line. And it transformed my understanding as an archaeologist of how to read Homer. I thought it was brilliant. I am definitely not a literary scholar. And these are the kinds of papers that we're looking for, where you can take what you're writing about and show why it's important to at least a significant sector of that wider field of Hellenic studies. Now, JHS, when I took over JHS at the beginning of 2021 last year, I inherited a very considerable backlog, which we are making an effort to dissipate as rapidly as possible. So I've got extra page space for 2022. We're moving all the reviews online. We're trying to get rid of that, and we've, for various reasons, ended up changing our production procedures so that once your paper gets edited, even if there's a delay, once your paper gets edited, it goes straight up online. So your paper will be published online ages before the actual print issue comes out, and it's out there exactly as Laurent said. And we're making an effort to deal with that backlog and catch up on it in that way. The other thing too that I have also done for authors is that if you have a paper that is accepted in JHS and you're doing all the things that young scholars do, like applying for jobs, or even older scholars do, applying for jobs and applying for grants and other things, that's fine. I, as editor, am always happy to write a letter for an accepted author and say, I can guarantee that this paper will come out in X time and it's accepted in JHS. So there are ways around it. And don't be put off if there's a bit of a wait. I mean, if you have a good paper and you get it accepted, that would be great. That is great. And it's great for you. It's a good journal to be published in because a very wide range of people across the field will read it. So I think that's really pretty much JHS and JRS, again, are very, very similar kinds of journals in their outlook.
Peter, yes, there's a bit of a discussion in the chat on what constitutes, what is niche and what is not niche, and whether being too niche leads to a desk rejection or not, which seems not to be the case. But yes, if you would like to say something about this.
So it's just one point that I wanted to mention, but I forgot to do so. It's been raised, I think, by Lynn too. Is one problem that I think the JRS has, possibly the JHS and Britannia to a lesser extent, is a sort of homeostasis of reputation. That because the JRS back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s tended to publish a slightly sort of musty air to it, the journalists in that period, with papers very focused on history and particularly institutional history, publishing relatively few papers on literary subjects or papers that engaged with more up-to-date theoretical approaches. My sense is that people tend to feel that the JRS is a journal for rather musty institutional history papers, and it's rather difficult for the journal to change that reputation if we don't get strong submissions in those other fields. So just in response to one of the comments in the chat, I would be extremely keen to have more papers published in the JRS which were using cutting-edge theoretical approaches, which were engaging in the field of reception studies, for instance, in which we get effectively no submissions at all, probably because we haven't in the past published papers in that area. I think if you have any doubts at all as to whether your paper might be suitable for our journals, as Lynn says, do just write to us. We're always very, very happy to provide a sort of quick, likely to be okay, probably not. Let's have a look and see what see whether it flies.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I think we'll need to come back to this aura of mustiness, or whatever you want to call it, because it meshes with the issue of gender and underrepresented groups, which is our main purpose today. I'll go back to the chat and what constitutes harsh and supportive. So Chrissy was saying harsh would mean refusal to see potential in an article, or refusal to engage with an approach, especially if different from the reviewer's own. Also ad hominem attacks, i.e. you're a failed scholar rather than this is a failed article. To which Lynn said that she would try to find reviewers who are who would be sympathetic to an approach. Alison wrote that supportive peer review, in my view, is when the reviewer reads the piece carefully on its own merits and suggests specific things to change, improve, remove, with specific references to overlooked scholarship, angles, ideas. Harsh reviews tend, in my experience, to be vague without any concrete suggestions for improvement. And as Christine mentioned, harsh reviews tend to extrapolate from the work in question to make comments about the broader abilities of the researcher or make snarky comments on small errors, etc. So I can comment here on having had the comment of, about language or not being native or that type of stuff. So, and then just go to bottom. Yeah, so I think those were the comments on being harsh and supportive. Catherine.
I hope you don't mind me coming in to comment on those comments, because I think I agree with them. I know I agree with them as to what constitutes a harsh and a supportive review, but I think they sort of raise some broader issues about what the relationship is of the editorial function to the peer review function and the authorial function. So I also happen to be a journal editor, although not one of the society journals. And I think Lynn mentioned that she isn't a literary scholar and she's editing a journal that accepts literary papers. And so it seems to me, one reason to have the peer review reports is to make sure that people with the right expertise, as Will has said, the right understanding of particular theoretical approaches, are giving an opinion on the paper and also giving feedback to the author. And that carries, weight. Expertise has some authority, but at the same time, the decisions on whether the paper is accepted or not are for the editor. And I've always found that if I see a harsh review that is, I think, making unfair comments about the broader abilities of the researcher, not the work, or being snarky or something like that, I can essentially reject the review. I have had some reviews come in for the journals I edit where the review has been very short and negative, and I thought, well, that's actually not giving enough on this paper, and I will always then commission another review. And I may indeed not share the first negative review with the author, even if it's written by someone who's very authoritative in the field, because I don't feel they've given this paper a fair reading. So we can spot as editors, I think some of that. But I wonder how the editors of these journals handle that question of the kind of weight and the authority of peer reviews, and then how authors respond.
Lynn?
Could I come in on that? Yes, I mean, Catherine, my approach is exactly like yours on that one, absolutely identical. That I do very much try to make sure that I get the right people to review papers, obviously, whose approach is going to harmonize with somebody else's, even if it's not my approach. So, that's a start. But if I get, and again, sometimes even especially often from very famous people, one can get very short and unhelpful reviews. And if that's the case, I do exactly what you do. I commission another review and sometimes do not bother to share the either harsh or more often just plain useless review of somebody who's only written 3 sentences. That's just not helpful. And we make sure that we really do try and make sure, and I know I am especially conscious of this in areas where I'm dealing with papers that are not in my field of expertise, that I am super fair about making sure that they get thoroughly and properly reviewed by appropriate people in appropriate ways. So again, a really nasty review, I would simply redact. I would not share if I felt that it was just vicious. I just think it's not helpful for anybody. And as an editor, normally we ask for 2 peer review reports, and sometimes you end up in a situation where the 2 reviewers have completely opposite views. Now, in cases like that, I would always turn to a third expertise in the field, sometimes someone from our editorial board, sometimes other experts that I know and trust in these fields, to give me an idea of where they think the paper stands in relation to those two reviews. And then when I send out a decision, I will send out all 3 reviews to the author. So I will seek more reviews if it's appropriate to do so. And these things happen. You know, reviewers can read papers in completely different ways. So we are on your side, guys. This is the critical thing.
Well,
yeah, I think just to follow up on what Lynn said. I mean, if I received a peer review that was, that I thought was tonally inappropriate, I would either change the tone. I would either change the tone of the review so that the content was, the actual content was the same, but the tone was changed, or I would seek another review. Certainly, our peer review processes are entirely anonymous, and when it goes, the peer review system is now very much an automated process, in that we certainly at Britannia we use the Scholar One submission system, which is a really good way for editors to actually keep track of what's going on. And so reviewers will receive, through that system, reviewers will receive entirely anonymized versions of the submitted texts. I think the peer review process has a lot of mystery about it. I think the only thing that I would add about the peer review process is that reviewers, it's worth remembering that peer review is unpaid. Most most reviewers are doing things between the interstices of their day jobs, and sometimes it can actually be quite hard to find reviewers for particular articles, and that may be because quite often potential peer reviewers will simply say, no, I can't do this because I've got too much other stuff on. So the process of finding peer review can be quite time consuming, and you will, as an editor, you will often go to several reviewers before you will find someone who feels able to actually take that on. So it's I think as reviewers, and most of us, all of us will do peer reviews as well. I think most peer reviewers will endeavour to say things that are ultimately helpful to the author. And I think if peer reviewers don't do that, as Lynn has said, I think as editors we will very much mediate that process.
thank you. Yes, so in the chat there's some comments on the difficulty of finding peer reviewers. Peter, I see your hand is raised. I think a question that I have back at the editors is whether you feed back to the reviewers who have written unhelpful reviews. Because being a peer reviewer, people are generally not trained, and even if there are explicit guidelines on how to do a peer review, it can be difficult to interpret those guidelines. So yes, I do wonder if you feedback. so that the peer reviewers can learn at whatever stage they are.
My sense is that the Journal of Roman Studies actually has a slightly different set of norms on peer review than some other journals. We have quite a large editorial board, about 14 people on the editorial board at the moment, gender balance, about a slight majority of women at the moment, and a large proportion of our peer review is done by the editorial board. So all papers being seriously considered for the JRS, in fact all papers being considered by the JRS will be read by a minimum of 2 reviewers, often 3, not infrequently 4, of whom normally, if they're being read by 3 reviewers, 2 of them will be from within the editorial board, sometimes all 3 from within the editorial board. And there are several reasons for that. There's obviously arguments about whether this is the best way of doing things. We do, of course, make use of external peer reviewers as well. One of the reasons for that is when we get a paper on a very specialized topic, if we receive a paper on the prosopography of the court of Maximinus Thrax or whatever it might be, there may well be 1 or 2, probably not more than 1 or 2 obvious peer reviewers for this who are specialists in that field, and one could ask those people to referee and make a judgment on the paper. My experience as editor has been that in those contexts, what I tend to get back is reports which are precisely these kind of reports that may be unhelpfully snarky, where many of the comments will be, why is the author not cited CIL 113946 and appears not to have engaged properly with Mommsen 1869 on this particular feature, which frankly for me as editor is not enormously helpful, partly because I don't care, partly because in fact those aren't the kinds of criteria on which we're judging whether papers are suitable for our journal or not. And what we have is an editorial board which is very experienced at refereeing papers for the JRS, and I've found often that it's more helpful for me as editor to get the views of someone who's not precisely in this field, but someone who is in the broad field of imperial history, knows things about the imperial court more generally, and can assess a paper sort of from a slightly different perspective, not about is this particular footnote right or wrong, but is the general argument here one that's exciting, novel, one that I haven't come across before, one that's likely to be of interest to a broader readership. That's not to say that I, as essentially a Roman historian, am going to be assessing papers on poetic techniques in Horace. I certainly won't do so. But I do try to have a balance in the peer reviewers between genuine specialists who provide one particular kind of service and people who are, if not generalists, in sort of neighboring or nearby fields, who it seems to me can give often more helpful feedback on actually how consequential and exciting this paper is likely to be for people in neighboring fields.
Thank you. Yes, that's the same in history of science journals on which I am, I'm on the board of several. They tend to have larger editorial boards, and they go to one of the people on the board for preliminary reports, and then it can go to fuller peer review. And it's very useful because the people on the board normally should know what the journal is about and might say, look, this is very good, but this is not the right place. I find this a good model. So I think perhaps now would be the time for a short break because it's 10:55. So we could make ourselves a cup of coffee, and come back at 11, and then perhaps talk more about gender and underrepresented groups. That sound okay?
Yes, and if in the meantime, if people want to put more questions in chat, that would be great because we can answer them. And Laurence, if you can save the chat as well, that would also be useful and interesting.
Yeah. That's done. Lynn, are you familiar with the George Sarton article on how to write a review, not a peer review, but a book review?
No, I'm not, but that would be really useful to know about. If you have a reference to it, do
Yes,
send it to me.
I'll find it's very old now, and
Yeah.
so it's a little bit outdated. But in the history of science, we made to read that, and it's still very useful, even though some of the language is a bit outdated.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And you know, writing good reviews is a real art. You know, one wants to be supportive, and you learn how to do it after a while. Also, at least I certainly found that having got a series of useless reviews for articles or grant applications or whatever is also, in a way, in a perverse way, quite helpful, because it teaches you about what a good review isn't, and teaches you how, you know, to say really helpful things in a review.
Yes.
I wonder how many universities incorporate training in writing at least book reviews in postgraduate taught programs.
We
I know
certainly
we did it a bit at
do.
Reading. In
Yeah,
the
we
master's
certainly
degree.
do at Liverpool, and we also, it's something we get undergraduates to do. And certainly when I've assigned, you know, doing a book review for undergraduates, I've always given them instructions in how to write a book review, because it's not a self-evident process, you know, how you read something critically, but helpfully. No, I think you're right. And I wonder, Catherine, if there isn't potential for the ICS to do more on the way of I mean, that's good that there's stuff from last year, but more on peer review training, where maybe those of us who are journal editors and things can help.
That would be fantastic. I am currently working on refreshing the ICS training offer. So one of the things I wanted
well,
to
I'm
get
very
from
happy
this
to
session myself
to
is,
help with
thank you, Lynn.
with peer review training, and I have a lot of experience of it.
I don't know, we've got a minute to restart, but I had a thought in response to your question about offering feedback to reviewers, Laurence. I'm aware this event is not about me as an editor, so I feel
It's difficult when you wear several hats.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to comment on that if you'd like me to.
Yes, I think that would be helpful.
Shall I do it right now? Yes.
Yes, please.
Sure.
I think people are there.
Okay. It's so hard in the Zoom environment, isn't it, to tell? What I was going to say in answer to Laurence's question about what we say to the peer reviewers, I found it a really interesting and challenging question. I have tended not to attempt to offer corrective feedback to reviewers whom I've construed as being unconstructive or unhelpful, because I tend to then think of them as an unconstructive reviewer, particularly if there's someone who is senior enough to know better. And I think these reviews often do come from people in that kind of position. I think people who are earlier career often take a lot of time and write very detailed reviews, and actually sometimes write, you know, you can tell that they've taken a very, very long time over this review. What I do is I don't use that reviewer again. I have the opposite problem with people who write wonderful, very constructive, but also critical reviews, because of course I want to use those people again, but bearing in mind what Will has said about reviewers being unremunerated, I try not to use the same reviewers too often for the journals I edit. So I can see on our submission system when they were last invited to review for the journal, and I try not to invite people more than once a year. I think it's also important to have a diversity of people reviewing for the journal. So one of the things that I always find myself asking myself questions about is, you know, am I relying on a network of people I know? How can I extend that network? This also goes for my work as ICS director. You know, how can I make sure that I'm connecting with the people who don't already know who I am? And I think that's something that all journal editors need to be thinking about. And actually all of us who are in these kind of positions that have some authority in relation to networks in classical studies, we all need to think about that.
Thank you. So I think we can start again properly. Thank you very much for being here to the second hour of this webinar. So the webinar was first suggested because there is a perceived issue. I think it's actually not perceived, it's an actual issue with the gender balance, but also the representation of underrepresented groups in the journals. I think if we could take questions or points of discussions on this, that would be great. So what do the editors, but also the audience, feel are barriers for certain groups to submit? I'd like to suggest, so I am a woman, and I feel I do a huge amount of reviewing and editing myself. And sometimes I wonder to what extent this it's not a burden. I take it with pleasure, but this the weight of mentoring sometimes I think prevents me from publishing myself. Because I think you've all editors hinted at the fact that you don't have the same issue with finding reviewers who are from underrepresented groups. So I can see that there's and Catherine agrees with me.
No, and I agree with that too. It's very easy to especially as one gets more senior, to do more mentoring and less writing. And while that's kind of our job when we get to be very senior, on the other hand, you trying to keep a balance can be very difficult. I mean, with the gender issue, certainly it is a real issue in JHS. In 2020, there were submissions from 84 male authors. Sorry, I'm not looking at you because I have another screen. 84 male authors, 25 female and 1 non-binary. And in terms of acceptances, that turned into 15 men and 4 women. Now, in 2021, when I took over, and can I say, I am the first woman to edit JHS since the inception of the journal in, wait for it, 1880. We had 65 submissions from men, 32 from women, and acceptances were 6 and 6, so they were equal. So the proportion of women actually went up quite considerably, but it's still too small.
Thank you. Peter?
One thing that I'd particularly like to hear people's comments on, if they're willing to do so, is the first 2 questions up on the screen, actually, about the sort of choice of where to target your research. If we take it that you have an excellent paper ready to go, what might mean that you think about pitching it JRS's way, as opposed to finding a suitable edited volume, or this being directly commissioned, or a conference volume, or so forth? I think that'd be something that'd be really helpful for me to hear about, what might attract more good research our way rather than towards edited volumes in particular.
Yeah, Chrissy has put something in the chat, so it can sometimes feel to me like the edited collection is an easier route to publishing, e.g. conference papers. If the conference puts together a volume and you're invited to contribute your paper, it feels like less pressure. Of course, it often takes longer, but you might know the editors and so feel less worried about the review process. So that's one of the reasons. hope we get some other comments. Well, you do get peer review with edited collections, both from the editors and sometimes from external reviewers as well.
Increasingly, yes, although it's a bit more hit and miss. It's a bit variable in my experience with edited collections.
Yes.
And it is certainly the case that peer review can take a really good article and make it into an absolutely outstanding one when you have really good, rigorous peer review. So peer review should not, I mean, I know people see it as scary, and one of the comments early on in the chat said it's scary, and yes, it can be. Exams are scary too. On the other hand, it really, really can improve your paper, and it is certainly the case that we as journal editors aim to ensure that the peer review process means that your paper will be the best that it can possibly be.
I'll let Will talk, thank you, but there's another comment from Sophie. I agree with Christine. Edited volumes are often thematically organized so that I already know whether my paper might be a good fit. So that is one factor. Will, and then Catherine.
Yeah, I suppose a couple of comments. First, relating to destinations of papers, but then relating to the question of representation. I think one of the things that one thing that I would consider very strongly, and I do consider very strongly as when I'm thinking about submitting, is the online presence of that. Is the online presence of that paper, perhaps something that is not necessarily in a top tier journal in inverted commas, but does have is, for example, open access. You will find that, and certainly we've monitored the reach of what the things that we've published in Britannia that are fully open access, and the reach of those papers is exponentially higher than the things in the printed volume. And so if I was advising someone on where to publish, I would really think very strongly about that online presence. In relation to representation, my predecessor at Britannia, Hella Eckhart, did quite a lot of work on particularly on gender in relation to the as part of the 50th anniversary celebrations of Britannia, and she did a great deal of work on that, and found that unsurprisingly that gender representation was pretty hovering at around women were responsible for around 20-25% of the papers. She also analysed it looking at different sectors, so where papers were coming from, whether they were and how that broke down along gender guidelines, along gender lines. And also looked at subject area. And one of the things that we found was that the place where women were most strongly represented in Britannia was in the area of artifact studies. And Ellen Swift has done some really good work on this, with the idea that suggesting that artifact studies have often seen as somehow second best, and so and that has been a factor in the number of women involved in artifact studies. So I think there's some really interesting aspects of subject representation. Certainly in the 2022 Britannia volume, gender representation is extremely poor in terms of that's partly because of the anniversary of Hadrian's visit to Britain. We've got a strong military themed volume, and that has, I think, really exacerbated the issues of representation of women in this particular journal. So I think there are some sort of really important issues about the way that our disciplines are structured, because of course the journals themselves are we feed into the structure of the discipline, but the journals themselves are also representations of that structure. So I think there are some really important things for us to think about, not only as journal editors, but as disciplines as a whole.
Thank you very much. So in the chat, there's a few comments about pressures to publish in upper tier journals and the pressures of the RAF. So we might want to come back to that, but Catherine.
I have a sort of grab bag of comments that relate to quite a bit of what's been said and going on in the chat. But I'm really intrigued by the idea that, which may be true, that women don't publish on Roman military topics. I noticed when I was at Reading that women undergraduates did not tend to write on Roman military topics. But I think, there's going to be another layer in Roman studies of thinking about how gender, whether it's contingent, the way in which gender and subject choice might correlate or not. But that's not what I wanted to say. I wanted to make a couple of points about some of the things that have come up in the chat around edited collections versus journal articles. I do think that, when you get peer review reports on a journal article, of course, both or however many peer review reports there are focused on that article, unless it's part of a journal special issue, in which case it might be a bit more like an edited collection, but hopefully there will still be some individual reports focused on that article. In publishing in edited collections, the reviewers write a review of the entire edited collection. This often has some comments on each article, but some of them can be quite summary. So the level of attention that is given to your specific article by the peer reviewer in a journal is often greater than in review reports on an edited collection. And you always have to sort of take a deep breath and steel yourself before you open those review reports, because it's always a nerve-wracking experience to get review reports on your publications. And certainly for me, that's never gone away. But in a way, a bit like having two scholars concentrate on your research for your PhD viva, it's a special level of attention. I was interested in, I think it was Sophie's comment that with an edited collection, Sophie already knows whether my paper might be a good fit. And I suppose that is a difference in that edited collections are from the start thematically organised, whereas general issues of journals tend not to be. And so if you have something that is article sized, a really good piece of independent research, I suppose there's a question of, well, do you just go ahead and submit it to a journal? Thinking, well, yes, it can stand on its own. Or do you feel perhaps a little bit more reticent about it, thinking, how is this going to fit in? The question of whether someone's article is a good fit with a general journal, say a general issue of JHS or JRS or Britannia, seems to me slightly different than the question of a thematic fit. And so I was interested in that as a response and wondered if we could tease apart that. I also wanted to say something about ref and prestige journals. Lynn and I were both on the REF panel this year, and I should say that I'm currently talking to Maria White, who was the chair of the REF panel, and I think probably within a couple of weeks, because the REF results are coming out next week, we'll be running from the ICS an online seminar with the REF chair and the REF Classics panel chair and hopefully the deputy chair. We haven't got a date for that yet, but obviously everyone is welcome to sign up. It's absolutely clear that REF does not care about where you publish. Whether it's in a book, whether it's in an edited collection, whether it's in a journal, REF is, which journal it is, REF is not, the reviewers are explicitly told that they should not take that into account. However, I do think journal reputation plays a role sometimes in universities' attempts to second guess the quality of articles for REF in their internal reviews. And, although it shouldn't, people have found that it plays a role in things like university panels looking at promotion applications and so on. I should say I have never attempted to submit an article to any of these 3 journals. And that's partly because a lot of my research has been in reception, and I suppose I would not think of those journals as the obvious good places to publish research in reception. I would probably go for Classical Receptions Journal or International Journal of the Classical Tradition, but I edit that, so I'm not allowed to submit to that. There are I wouldn't want to say that the idea of top journals is a myth, because it isn't, and it does have importance in certain areas. But I think there is a lot of mythologizing around it, particularly in its relation to REF. And I expect that's probably something that Maria White will comment on when she has an opportunity to comment in the wake of the REF results next week. I've talked for over a long time, sorry, but I hope they were all useful points to make.
Don't worry. I'll let Peter talk in a minute, but I think it's very important not to create this false dichotomy between journals and edited collections. Sometimes the editor of an edited collection is the best peer reviewer for, that is in the world for a collection. That's why they're putting the collection together in the first place. And they might offer a very high level of
support and feedback. That's very true. Yes,
I have received extraordinary feedback when publishing in some edited collection, and very poor feedback from journals. I think you can't generalize. So sometimes it is the right choice to publish in an edited collection. Yes, Peter.
I just wanted to make one point following up from Catherine's seems to be extremely sensible comments a moment ago, which is that I think it's worth being really clear as to who you want to read your work. For which there isn't actually a single right answer. If you have a paper on, as it were, art history and ekphrasis in Lucan, in Lucian, or Lucan for that matter, there's an obvious reason to publish in an edited volume that's on art history in Greek authors of the second sophistic, because your paper will then be alongside other papers on very similar themes that will make a nice coherent volume. But given the vast proliferation of edited volumes and conference volumes, none of us read everything, none of us read even a very small minority of what's published in the field. The chances are that means your piece will be read by people who are already interested in art history in the literature of the second sophistic. It seems to be one of the particular features of journals like JRS and Britannia, that because they have a much broader readership, your article may then be read by people who didn't think beforehand they were going to be interested in ekphrasis in Lucian, but might become so by dint of reading an article in a publication of that kind. That's not to say it's better to publish in that context. It means that you will genuinely be read by different people.
Lynn? You're on mute, Lynn.
I'm just unmuting. Yes, sorry about that. No, and I think what Peter says and what you guys have been saying is very wise. I mean, ironically, I've never published anything in JHS, even though I am now editing it for all sorts of complicated reasons. And of course, for the next few years, obviously, I won't be. But it is about readership and where your work belongs. I mean, the advice I normally give to colleagues and PhD students is publish your work where it's going to find the right audience, and the people that you want to read it are going to read it. And sometimes that's an edited volume for certain kinds of pieces. Sometimes it's an online journal. Sometimes it's something different altogether. Sometimes it's a book. You know, it doesn't matter that much. And as Catherine said, for those of you in the UK system for REF, it doesn't matter where your work is published. If it's submitted for REF, it'll all be read properly anyway, because we all read the stuff. Having said that, the thing about at least our 3 journals is that what you will get there, exactly as Peter said, is a very broad audience. And I think it's a really good opportunity for submitting authors to be able to take something quite specific from their own field of research and think about, what's the big idea? What does this topic that I'm writing about and this research that I'm doing, how does that speak to the broader field and have an impact on other areas of the broader field that I maybe hadn't thought about so much, or that it could be really useful for. And the very best and most interesting articles, certainly in JHS, and I would say the same thing is probably true in JRS, are those articles that have really got that good big idea out of often a very specialized area. That's fine, that's no problem. But taking that specialized area and saying, this is why, because it has implications for all of these other things. So why should I know about harbors in pseudo-skylax? Well, it's because potentially they can tell us really interesting things about ancient economies or ancient trade or ancient maritime connections. And if I'm somebody who does maritime archaeology, this would be really useful to know. And it's a question of you as an author really simply bringing out those wider implications. And that's what makes a really outstanding article, certainly for our 3 journals, I think. Is that fair, Peter and Will? That's kind of what we're looking for. And if you just sit and think about it a bit and talk to colleagues and talk to friends, it isn't actually necessarily so intimidating or difficult to do as it might seem. And you can always ask us.
Unless Peter wants to get back on this. No? There's a little bit of discussion in the chat about military history, which then got into something broader, which is very interesting, which is whether editors are trying to actively correct lack of balance, for instance, by soliciting or favoring submissions from the underrepresented gender or group. So that was some rule. So if some of the editors would like to say something to that.
Could I just come in on that, as I've been sort of involved in this discussion in the chat? Yeah, I think there are things that we can do as editors. And you know, someone else asked about the nature of thematic aspect of the 2022 Britannia. We've done thematic issues of Britannia before, and I would say it's only part of the journal that has a theme. So we will have a group of sort of 5 or 6 papers addressing that particular theme. But yeah, I mean this didn't happen for this particular thematic issue of Britannia for a number of reasons. But I think if you are preparing those sorts of things. I think you can, there are certain things that we like to approach in the journal, and I think it's we can have a certain impact on on the makeup of that on the makeup of the journal in that way. I'd also sort of draw attention, I think, to something that we've been looking at in the Roman Research Trust, and I sit on the Roman Research Trust's grant awarding panel, and we've now introduced representation as a criterion in our grant awarding process, that we expect applicants to consider representation within their applications. So I think there are some sort of really concrete things that we can be doing as a discipline.
Peter?
Just on the very specific question in response to Roel's, sorry, I may have mispronounced your name, Roel's comment in the chat. At the JRS, we don't favour submissions from any group, and the bar for entry to the JRS is the same for all submissions. Soliciting, certainly yes. Concrete things that I've done, I'd be very helpful to hear of others. I mean, aside from this event, one is a small amount of cold calling of people whose work I or other members of the journal have enjoyed, who we would like to encourage to publish in the journal. We've done a certain amount of that. Something else that I encourage, that I do, and that I hope other board members do, is again something we encourage people to do, is when we hear really good papers at seminars, going and having a word with the author and encouraging them to send their work our way. And something else that I've done actually quite a lot of, with some success in fact, is people who have published a short review in the JRS or a longer review and have produced really interesting, thoughtful work as a reviewer, or when I've read really fine reviews by people, to then encourage such authors to come back to us with more substantial pieces. And certainly in the last couple of years of the journal, there have been, because that's in part a way of getting to know people and good quality, really top quality scholars in fields that I otherwise know nothing about. And we've certainly had some really excellent pieces coming to us in the last couple of years from people who wrote really sparky, interesting book reviews for us, and then saying, well, come and talk to us about other bits of your work. You know, this is great. Can we have more of this in the journal, please? But if others have other suggestions as to ways in which we can actively solicit or encourage individuals as opposed to collectivities to submit to us, we'd be very interested to hear about that.
Thank you. Yes, so Catherine was asking about special issues. Maybe Lynn wants to say something to that. I think it would be very hard for JSS to do special issues because it only publishes once a year and already has too much. And I think that's the same for JRS, isn't it? Lynn.
No, I was just going to say, I think everything that Peter is talking about is certainly stuff that I do, and I do certainly encourage people that I meet that look like they're doing interesting work to submit to JHS, and obviously the peer review process is the same for anybody. Nobody, even just because I've said to somebody, I'd really love to see you submit an article, doesn't mean they get special treatment. That would not be appropriate or fair. But I do really want to see a wide range of things coming in internationally and from all over the place. The other thing I do is, when I'm in conferences, and I am trying to go to the big conferences now that we can actually, God forbid, travel again, and go to things like, the SAS and the AIA and the EAA and all of these sorts of things, just to make sure that I talk with people about the journal, that I'm there to answer questions and make people feel that the journal has a human face, and that if they submit their work, it will be treated respectfully and seriously and properly considered. So, we really do want a wide range of approaches, scholars, scholarship, subject areas coming in. This is what the health of these kinds of general journals depend on. The other thing, in response to a question earlier on about not the work of non-native speakers and so forth, is to say that actually a lot of our journal articles are published by people from all over the world, many of whom are non-native English speakers. And we certainly are keen to have international work from a wide range of scholarly traditions. You know, classic sensu lato is a very international field, and there isn't one scholarly tradition. There are many, and we want to represent all of those appropriately. And as we also use many, many international reviewers, a great number of whom are also not native English speakers. And sometimes I get reviews where the person's read the thing in English, but the review might come in French or in German or something like that. And you know what, that's fine. I don't mind that. The critical thing is that people have reviewed it appropriately. And we certainly want to see non-native speakers and non-native reviewers involved in the process of reviewing for the journal.
Yes, in the chat, there's something about book reviews and the fact that reviews editors are always very keen to have people volunteer or pitch reviews. That's very, very true. So please do. It can be difficult to find book reviewers. So okay, there's a bit of a lull right here. Catherine.
Could I leap in and be rude and ask a question? I would love to hear from you in the audience. What do you we've told you lots of things that we're already doing. Can you think of anything else that we could do that would better support prospective authors, that would reassure prospective authors? It would be really helpful for us to know what kinds of support you as prospective authors would find most useful. Or of the things that we're doing already, what you would find particularly useful or not useful.
Yes, please put that in the chat. And in the meantime, Alison was asking how to be a peer reviewer. Sometimes it's just a case of going to conferences and talking to people, or volunteering to a journal and pitching.
It's interesting for me to hear some of the Society Journal editors saying they welcome people pitching book reviews to them. I think that's a very useful piece of information to get out there. I think most journal editors are very happy to know that there's a wide group of people who are willing to peer review. I'd put in the chat that I often feel reticent about asking people who don't have permanent contracts, because I'm essentially asking people to do another bit of unpaid work. But it's good to know, you know, that some people would like to do that. I've also had numerous conversations, I have to say, with a journal publisher about the idea of introducing pay for peer review of journal articles, and so far got nowhere. But I continue to try to have those conversations. And when I do ask an early career scholar, I try to make it very clear in my review invitation that I'll understand if they don't want to take it up. I think sometimes it can be hard. You know, people can feel that they can't say no, especially if it's, you know, someone who's more senior who's asking them. So I think carefully about tone there. But as you can probably tell from my tone, I struggle with this, actually. I struggle with this.
Will.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky issue, and like Catherine, I think I'm sometimes reticent to ask early career researchers, and I think quite often early career researchers are, can be nervous about doing peer review, even though it is, it's an anonymous process. I mean, I would, very much like to hear from, people who would be interested in doing peer review. One of the things that I started doing as editor of Britannia, and actually as book reviews, when I was the book reviews editor, was drawing up a list of people and under broad headings of expertise, because I was aware that mentally, when I was thinking about people to do reviews of both books and then subsequently peer reviews, that I was concerned that I was going to be going back to the same people and drawing on a network of people I knew, the people who sprang to mind. So I have been drawing up a list of people under subject areas in order to try and broaden the pool of reviewers and stop that sort of, I think, that automatic thing that a lot of us suffer from as editors, as to going to the people that we know. So yeah, certainly from my point of view, if people are interested in doing peer review, but I may not have come across, come across you, because my science for creating this list is pretty imprecise. I've got to say, do get in touch. I'd be really very happy to hear from you.
Lynn.
Typing a reply at the same time to something else. I feel very similarly to Catherine about peer review for early career scholars. One doesn't want to impose on people or put undue burdens on people. On the other hand, it is also potentially an opportunity. And one thing that works very nicely now with CUP and Scholar One, which we're moving on to in the next year, like Britannia is that you can actually accumulate, you can actually record peer review that you do and for what journals via your ORCID ID. And that is really useful, because then you have actual documentation of this. And although obviously we can't pay peer reviewers for peer reviewing, we can documenting that people are doing that peer review and doing a good job at it, so that it supports them in other ways. I know it's not much, but it's something.
Thank you. Yes, I think something around, oh, Lynn.
I was just going to say, and in fact, if nobody else wants to say anything, I was just going to reply to Solveig about bearing the statistics of submissions. It would be interesting to know in more concrete terms what makes the few papers which end up being accepted stand out from the others. And I would say it's basically the importance of the research, the importance and the originality and the rigor of the research. So this is a really good, solid, terrific piece of research that is actually important. And the way in which the author demonstrates that research is important beyond its own specialist subject field, so that you can say exactly as I did before, that whatever you're doing on, say, harbors in pseudo skylax has implications for other adjacent fields. That's and is certainly for our journals, that's what's critically important and makes them stand out. Is that a fair way of putting it, Peter and Will? I mean, I think it's probably the same for you guys as well.
I think that's entirely fair. One very simple, I hope extremely obvious thing that I think is worth saying though is it's worth looking at some recent issues of the journals. We get a surprising number of submissions to the JRS from people who clearly have never read anything in the journal, where nothing in the bibliography kind of bears any relation to anything we've ever published in the journal before, and things that are just very, very obviously things would be much better suited in the Journal of Roman Archaeology or whatever it is. In a sense, if you're not familiar with the kinds of things the journals tend to publish, it's well worth at least just having a look through a couple of recent issues of the journal and seeing if you find the articles in our journals interesting before sending things our way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, sorry.
Go ahead, you go first, Will.
I would say that from the Britannia's point of view, purely because of the subject area coverage, and Britain is a lot smaller than the rest of the Roman Empire, and has much less textual evidence. We get fewer submissions, so the strike rate, I suppose, for us is probably higher. I would say that the papers that have been, what makes a really good paper for us is, in terms of the archaeology, it can be some really exciting new data that's put in that changes our understanding of the province more generally, or it can be a new and original take on existing material, and we quite often find actually that some of the best papers in that area do come from early career researchers. I think quite often, because of the smaller number of submissions that we get to Britannia, there are often things that the peer reviewers will quite often not say, not reject outright, but they will suggest ways in which that paper can be improved or made more suitable to publication, for publication. So for us, that process of initial peer review can actually be the start of a longer dialogue in which an author will resubmit a paper, and sometimes the resubmission will be so different that we'll send it out to peer reviewers again, or otherwise it's something that I will deal with as editor, and I will look at the resubmission and see if I consider that the resubmission has dealt sufficiently with the criticisms of the peer reviewers. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing, actually, to see this quite often as a dialogue between you and the journal. That initial submission and the initial response, certainly for us, is Britannia is not the end of the process.
Thank you very much. So in the chat, there's a bit of discussion on people with big data sets, and the answers are that this can be published as supplementary material. I'm sure that Alice, you've thought about this problem, but there's also ways of publishing the data set separately, and then refer to that in the article. Lynn.
Yeah, and yes, indeed, we're, like all of us, I think, very happy with supplementary material, and CUP makes it very easy for us to do that. I was just going to agree with Will, and I think the same is probably true for Peter, though he can speak for himself on this, is that yes, when you engage with any of our journals, it's not like we send it out for peer review and then you get an answer back and that's it, goodbye. Many times where we feel a paper is very strong but not quite ready, we're very happy to do a lot of work with the author and have quite a long conversation with authors over making the paper, getting the paper to be the best as it can be, and make sure that it's really right for the journal and is going to show off the author's research and talents in the best possible way. And we do this with really quite a lot of the papers that we accept. So even if a paper is accepted, the minor corrections might be quite a substantial conversation. So yes, don't think that we're just going to, throw you in the bin immediately. It doesn't work like that. And even when we reject papers, we can have quite long conversations with authors about where they might best publish it and give some advice and, just try and support people. We do try and do this.
Thank you very much. I see Peter has put a list of very interesting articles and how successful they are. They raise a question to me, though. I happen to know quite a few of these people, and they're in very prestigious institutions. And another issue with representation is linked to that. So in which institution you are, and I wonder if you have thoughts about this. So I see Princeton, I see British Columbia, Princeton again. So this is these scholars are wonderful, but yes, I welcome your thoughts on this. And Lynn, if Lynn prefers talking first, or Will?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, certainly in JHS, obviously peer review is completely anonymous. So, the reviewers not only have no idea who the author is, but they have no idea what institution or country or anything else they come from. So all of that is anonymous and only comes out in the end. And we get papers from people who are independent scholars who have no institutional affiliation, but they're still very good papers. We have papers from people who are in a range of smaller institutions around the world. We also get people from big prestigious institutions. It's really quite a mix.
No, of course, that's perhaps not quite my question. I know that the peer review is anonymous, but these people might be getting support, institutional support that might not be available to other people. And again,
absolutely,
it does mesh it with underrepresented groups and with the issue of gender. Although I appreciate that Peter's group is very inclusive and very interesting, but.
Yeah, and I think that's where we can offer editorial support, whereas to the extent that we can, that can be very helpful for people who are, for example, from institutions or countries where they might not have as much support as if you're sitting in Princeton or something. So, at the moment, we do our best. Right. But it's a genuine problem, and I think it's certainly worth raising.
Will, and then Catherine, and then we're coming to the end probably. But,
yeah, I think on where our authors come from. I think in as far as Britannia goes, I mean, much of the really interesting stuff coming out of Rome and Britain at the moment is coming from the commercial sector. You've probably all seen, some of the material that's coming out of, for example, HS2. And so I would say that probably a good 50% of our authors at the moment are coming from a non-university context. And that does raise challenges for those authors in that in the commercial sector it can be quite hard for authors to find the time to take their work beyond an initial archive report process to something that we would want to publish. But again, we do very much try to work with authors on those issues, and very much help them as much as we can. But I think we're certainly finding that a lot of our most exciting material is actually coming from outside the academic sector at the moment.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Catherine.
I wanted to back up. Agree with your point, Laurence, that of course institutions are able to and do support the research of their research active staff and students in radically different ways. Some institutions have much more lavish research leave than others. Some institutions are able to put all kinds of opportunities to travel and do primary fieldwork and archival research in the way of their students, and some don't. I myself did a second postdoc in Oxford where I got really excellent mentoring from someone who was a former editor of JHS, in fact, who helped me to feel confident about my first journal submissions and advised me on which journals to submit to. And that was really important for me because I needed that help at that time. And I was in an institution with someone who was very experienced who could do that. The question is, so, you know, people who don't have those advantages in terms of their institutional context can be writing really good stuff, but there's definitely an institutional, you know, advantage built in, I think, in these ways. I suppose the question would be, what can people do in order to support and give that kind of tailored support to people who don't have it within their institutions? I think WCC UK with the mentoring scheme is already thinking about ways in which we can do that. It's something I would like to think about more as ICS director, but it would be useful if people have ideas to put that in the chat as well. I don't think all of that support can come from the journal editors. I think it's, you know, we have to try and take responsibility for this as a kind of subject community more broadly.
Yes, definitely. And Pat in the chat says that some of us are independent scholars. Yeah. I think Lynn did mention independent scholars in passing, but yes, it's true. If you don't have the support of an institution, and people in archaeology, they will still have a sort of support to publish. They might have some study leave days or something like that, which independent scholars will not.
Could I just mention here, I know we're on -2, but I've brought in a new scheme with the support of the Hellenic Society and the Roman Society, and the application deadline is in a week's time. And this is for small grants of up to £300 each to enable people who don't have institutional funding to make research trips to the Combined Classics Library in the Institute. And part of the thinking behind that was also about independent scholars, as well as, for example, unfunded postgraduate research students. I know it's a small thing, small grants of up to £300, but it's about trying to find ways to enable people to access our research collections. So if that would be useful for anyone on this meeting, please feel free to apply. The closing date is the 13th of May.
Thank you very much. I think on this we'll close this meeting. Thank you very much to all the participants, the editors, of course, but also Catherine, the director of the ICS, and all the members in the audience. Thank you for some excellent points of discussion, and I think we can have a sort of debrief after this and think whether perhaps we can make this an annual event, as some of our WCC events are. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely weekend. Thank you. If the editors have 5 minutes to stay afterwards, I think it would be good to do it.
That's fine. Yeah, and thank you all for participating.
Stop share. Stop the recording.